Hello, everyone, and welcome to this exclusive interview with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I'm your host, Ronnie Kroell, and I have lovingly entitled this interview, Bobby Curious. You've thought about it, you're afraid of what your family and friends might say, and you're downright frustrated with the partisan hatred and the climate of our politics today. Well, today we're creating a safe space. This is a safe space where we're going to talk about the issues that matter most to the LGBT community and to all Americans. Without further ado, let's dive in. Hello, Mr. Kennedy. How are you today?
How are you? Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. It really means a lot. We have so much to ask you that the LGBTQ community really wants to know, if you are President of the United States, how you're going to protect them. So I wanted to start by saying your family has a long legacy in civil rights, protecting the African American community, looking after Latinos, looking after the Native Americans. And I imagine your exposure to your family's work and your own personal exposure to working with these communities, you've been exposed to the LGBT community, right?
Yeah, of course. I grew up during the Civil Rights Movement. My home at Hickory Hill was a satellite White House, and a lot of the decisions that were critical milestones of the Civil Rights Movement happened at my house. Integration of the University of Alabama, the Freedom Riders, the integration by James Meredith of Mississippi, where my father sent U.S. Marshals down, and it's described often as the last battle of the American Civil War, and many of the other important battles of the Civil Rights Movement were directed by my father, who was then the Attorney General from our house. After my uncle's death in 1963, he continued to make civil rights the priority for his political energies, and as you say, when he ran for president, I think of the 70 stops he made as president, 10 of them were at Indian reservations, and probably 10 or 20 were in African American communities, Hispanic communities, etc. That was a priority. My father was killed in '68. Around the time, I forget the year that Stonewall happened.
1969 was Stonewall.
So it was a year before Stonewall. But my uncle, Ted Kennedy, became the first real gay rights activist in the United States Senate. In 1980, when he ran for president, he was the first presidential candidate in history to actively court the gay vote. I campaigned with him and then many times without him in the Castro up in San Francisco. And that was at a time when no politician was going there. Teddy was the only one. And then Teddy was chair of the Senate Health Committee for 50 years. And one of his biggest issues was making sure that AIDS research was fully funded. He had a famous battle with Anthony Fauci at that time, who was trying to ban any kind of therapeutic drugs. He was trying to steer all of the business toward AZT, which was his drug with GlaxoSmithKline, which was then called Burroughs Wellcome. And there were many all of the symptomology of AIDS were other diseases for which there were therapeutic drugs. And Dr. Fauci was trying to prevent people who were suffering from AIDS from acquiring those drugs, and that's why there were then buyers clubs. Famously the Dallas Buyers Club. There were Buyers Club in all the big cities with gay populations in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Dallas, etc. And those were people who were going to foreign countries to buy illegal therapeutic drugs to bring them back to the United States, to give them to people who were suffering from AIDS and who did not want to get on the AZT regimen, which was killing people. John Lawrenson, who was one of the most famous researchers and journalists in the AIDS community at that point, estimates that 330,000 gay men were killed by AZT. between 1989, I think it was approved, and 2019, particularly in the early days. And a lot of people did not want to get on AZT. They wanted to try these other therapeutic drugs, and Anthony Fauci refused to test them for efficacy. And my uncle ultimately forced him to test them. My uncle hired Terry Byrne, who was the first openly gay chief of staff in the United States Senate for any senator. Terry Byrne was also the first HIV-infected, openly HIV-infected staffer in the United States Senate history, and my uncle engendered a lot of controversy by hiring him and then promoting and protecting him. And Terry Byrne worked with Teddy to make sure that HIV research was fully funded, and that alternative drugs and therapeutics other than AZT were available to people who are suffering from HIV and AIDS.
I'm grateful that you brought that up, because so many people like myself want to support your candidacy for president, but there are some reservations out there. And, you know, I jokingly say this to you because when I came out, it was one of the hardest things I ever had to do. You know, I was about 15 or 16 years old. People were still being bullied, beaten up, and even their lives were being taken. And so it was a very scary thing to do. Never until my supporting you have I felt that kind of abuse, even from the LGBT community.
Sorry about that.
You know,
That's a common story.
People have been so nasty to me, and I just don't understand why. And I wanted to just let you know that while I support you, and you know that you have my support, I'm not going to be easy on you. I have a few pretty tough questions for you. I want to
unload them.
Get right into them. So there's a video out there on the internet that seems to show you speaking about HIV/AIDS and linking it to the recreational drug known as poppers. Your quote is, "There's a lot of people that said it's not a virus. The virus is a passenger virus, and these people are dying mainly because of poppers. 100% of the people who died in the first 1,000 cases were with AIDS were people who are addicted to poppers, which are known to cause Kaposi sarcoma in rats." Do you believe today that HIV/AIDS is caused by poppers, or was this something taken out of context?
Yeah, that's something that I never believed. And in fact, I have chapters in my book on this issue, in my Anthony Fauci book, and chapter 5 and chapter 6 in that book are specifically about that issue. And I specifically say that I'm agnostic as to the relationship between HIV and AIDS. My inclination is to believe that there is a relationship. But what I was pointing out was that the HIV explanation for AIDS is complex. It doesn't account for AIDS cases that occur in people who don't have HIV, which is well documented. Anthony Fauci calls it idiopathic AIDS. It's AIDS that is of an unknown origin. If HIV is the only cause of AIDS, those should not exist. Furthermore, there are many millions of people around the world who have HIV untreated and never get AIDS. So it's a complex explanation, and there was particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, there were many of the top scientists in the world who were suggesting that HIV may be a cofactor in AIDS, and that there were other factors. And in fact, the two men who discovered AIDS, which is Robert Gallo, who was at the National Cancer Institute, and then Luc Montagnier, who was the actual discoverer of the HIV virus and the first to link it to AIDS, and who won the Nobel Prize in 1983 for that. Both of them ended up believing that HIV was a cofactor. And in fact, Robert Gallo found another virus called human herpes virus 6, which is a genuine cell-killing, DNA-destroying virus that they found in almost everybody that they tested for AIDS, and that he believed that that was a cofactor in AIDS, that HIV had some relationship to it, but that the most destructive cause of it was HHV6. Luc Montagnier ended up believing also that HIV was a benign virus. And this is the man who received the Nobel Prize for discovering AIDS. And he believed that there was a companion virus called myoplasms that were the actual killer. Now, I don't have the capacity to assess that evidence.
Right.
Well, the reason I recited this in my book is there are many scientists, the top scientists of that era, people like Peter Duesenberg, who were offering other explanations for AIDS that in a perfect system should have been paid attention to, because it may have allowed a more effective treatment faster. And as you know, AZT was, which was the only treatment that was available for almost 2 decades, was a very controversial treatment. It was a deadly chemotherapy. It was, in fact, it was invented in the early 60s, I think in 1964 by NIH, and that it was thrown on a garbage heap because it was invented as a chemotherapy drug. Mm-hmm. And it was regarded as too dangerous for chemotherapy. So in chemotherapy, you're only giving it to somebody for 2 weeks and hoping that it kills the tumor rather than the person. Oh, to give that to somebody for the rest of their lives is really a death sentence. And AZT was controversial, and I think one could argue that we should have been studying some of these other theories because it given us a more complete understanding of the cause and the cure for AIDS. In terms of Kaposi sarcoma, Kaposi sarcoma was initially regarded as the signal for AIDS. Mm-hmm. The first 5 men who were diagnosed with AIDS in 1981 in California all suffered Kaposi sarcoma, and this was noteworthy because Kaposi sarcoma had never been seen in a young person before. It was a disease exclusively affecting old people. And originally, it was regarded as the signal for AIDS. And then researchers began finding cases of Kaposi sarcoma, many of them, where HIV was not associated. And in the 1990s, there was a movement by some of the leading institutions and scientists to remove Kaposi sarcoma altogether from AIDS symptomology. And Kaposi sarcoma, many of those scientists concluded that Kaposi sarcoma was associated with, was caused not by HIV, clearly it wasn't, but that it was caused instead probably by other exposures, chemical exposures, and particularly poppers, amyl nitrate. Amyl nitrate causes tumor growth in rats. There's plenty of studies out there that show that it also is associated with Kaposi sarcoma in young men. And we now know more about Kaposi sarcoma. The Kaposi sarcoma is actually associated with a herpes virus, and it's called KSHA or HHKS. And the theory is that that poppers actually facilitate the entrance of that virus into the cell. They open up the cell tissue, the cell barrier.
I see.
And so there's a scientific association, there's biological plausibility. But I think people worry when they hear me saying something like that because they think that that's the kind of thing people said who were trying to blame AIDS, the disease, on the victims by saying that, okay, well, these people...
Gay people are responsible.
Gay people are responsible because they were engaging in degenerate behavior.
Right.
I don't believe that. And I think the reason I'm interested in studying this issue is because I believe that, we should have good science on this. And I just, that's something that would never enter my head. I believe that everybody deserves human dignity. Everybody deserves kindness, that people's dispositions, their sexual orientation, their lifestyle choices, who they love is not a reason to deprive anybody of their rights, of their dignity, of the respect that we show them, of the compassion and kindness that we show each other. So, I understand that there are probably people out there who make that connection in their head, but for me, this is a subject of scientific and medical curiosity, and I think it's something that we ought to be able to talk about.
And I agree. And I want to piggyback on that and go directly into the fact that there's also been a video out there with, I think, Jordan Peterson, where you had brought up atrazine in the water, chemicals that are, there's been studies on frogs where in these studies the frogs had been shown to be sterile or to their gender was morphing. And in that interview you said that if this is happening in frogs, then it's happening to our kids.
Yeah, well, I didn't actually say that. I would never go that far. I think first of all, the study that I was referring to is a study by a researcher at, I think he's UC Berkeley. His name's Tyler Hayes, and I've actually met him and spoken to him. I've had him on my podcast. He's a very interesting African-American, brilliant scientist. And he took African frogs, about 70 frogs, and put them in a aquarium with water that had levels of atrazine that were below the EPA maximum contaminant levels. So they were levels that are considered safe by EPA in drinking water. And there's atrazine now in about 63% of the drinking water supplies in our country. The frogs that were exposed to these very low levels or modest levels of atrazine, I think 60 of them became sterile, and the remaining 10 or 10%, I forget what the number was, they were all male. They started out male. 10% turned female and were able to produce fertile eggs. So you've had a demonstration now in an animal model of these dramatic gender transformations in frogs. Now, is that applicable to human beings? Sometimes oftentimes animal models are applicable to some process that might happen in human beings. There's nothing that we can say about that, other than that.
Are there studies that exist now, or am I correct in presuming that you're just asking the questions? You want to know.
Yeah, what I've said is we should be studying it. And by the way, I've been talking about this for 40 years, long before this study. There are all kinds of endocrine disruptors that we are putting out in the environment. PCBs that I've been fighting for 40 years are a very potent endocrine disruptor. There are many other endocrine disruptors in pesticides, in the chemicals that we're putting in our food and our water supply. Endocrine disruptors are chemicals that disrupt or distort human sexual behavior. And atrazine clearly is highly likely is one of those.
Right.
And we ought to be studying it. We ought to be studying all of them, and we ought to be studying the impact. We're seeing impacts in human sexual development. We're seeing these tremendous drops in fertility. We're seeing early puberty now, dramatically early puberty, and particularly in girls. And we ought to understand what we're doing to our children because of this toxic soup that our kids are now swimming around in.
I mean, you've been a successful trial attorney, an environmental trial attorney for decades, and you've been fighting the good fight, winning major cases, not only against federal agencies, but also the major corporate polluters. And you have seen firsthand the effects that this has had on our water, our soil, our food, our health. How would you, as president, from day one, go into the office leveraging your experience to to divorce this corporate merger of state and corporations? How do you do that?
We're seeing corporate capture in virtually every agency of the government. I've sued most of the agencies, but the oil and coal industry and the chemical industries have a tremendous impact on EPA. And I'll just give you an example. When we sued the Monsanto, and I was on the trial team, during discovery, we came across email exchanges that proved that the head of the pesticide division at EPA for a decade, a guy called Jess Rowland, was secretly working the entire time for Monsanto. And he was killing studies for them. He was creating phony studies. He was bringing in these, mercenary industry scientists. We call them biostitutes to design studies that would exonerate or exculpate Monsanto and glyphosate from the cancer epidemics that we were seeing, the cancer explosions. And he was killing studies not only at EPA but at other agencies to make sure nobody studied the links between exposure to Roundup and tumor growth. And he did that successfully. Well, that agency was not working for the American people. It was working to promote the mercantile interests of this chemical company.
Right.
And unfortunately, that is not an exception. Jess Rowland is not an exception. He's the rule. We see that across. We see the big communications companies, the big cell phone companies control the Federal Communications Commission. The military industrial complex, the big military contractors control the intelligence agencies, which, whose job has become to provide us a constant pipeline of new wars. The FDA gets half of its budget from pharmaceutical companies, so they own it.
Right.
NIH scientists receive royalties for every product that they help develop. They personally royalties, $150,000 a year. These are supposed to be regulators. They're supposed to be looking for problems in those products. But if you're paying your mortgage, your kid's education, you're for your boat, your alimony, if that drug gets promoted and nobody sees any problems,
it's a big payday.
Yeah, you're going to overlook problems, and the individual commercial interests are going to ultimately subvert the regulatory function of that agency, and that's what we're seeing across the board. And I've litigated against almost all these. USDA, the Department of Agriculture, is controlled by the big agricultural conglomerates, the factory farmers, the chemical companies, and I've litigated against almost all of these agencies. And when you sue the agency, you get a PhD in corporate capture and how to unravel it.
So what do you do from day one in the Oval Office? What do you do?
Here's what I would do. Here's what I would do just at FDA, for example, or let's pick NIH. NIH, when I was a kid, was the gold standard scientific research organization in the world. Nobody had anything like it. And I used to go there when I was a kid because I lived very close by, and I wanted to be a scientist myself. I knew a scientist who worked there, and I would go there and look at the rats and the mice and look through the microscopes. And to me, it was, fascinating. And everybody looked at NIH for good science. In fact, other countries didn't have research agencies like that, and they would have in their statutes, their constitution, that if NIH says it's okay, then it's okay. In 1980, Congress passed a rule called the Bayh-Dole Act that said that individuals who work at NIH can collect royalties on drugs that they help develop. and that the agency itself can collect royalties. So, for example, the Moderna vaccine is 50% owned by NIH, and they were promoting that vaccine. They're getting billions of dollars from that vaccine. There are 6 individuals who work for NIH who will collect $150,000 a year forever, as long as mRNA platforms are on the market. So this distorts everything. And what's happened at NIH is it's become an incubator for pharmaceutical products. It's no longer doing science. It's no longer studying why are Americans so sick. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60% do. Our kids are almost all of them. It's hard to find an undamaged kid, kids who aren't suffering from neurological diseases, from allergic disease, peanut allergies, eczema,
Autoimmune deficiency.
autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile diabetes. When I was a kid, the average pediatrician would see 1 case of juvenile diabetes in his lifetime. Today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door is diabetic or pre-diabetic. Why is this happening? NIH's job is to find that out,
Right.
but it's not looking for it, and it won't look for it because it knows that there's some big company that is responsible for that. It's the pharmaceutical companies, it's the food, or chemical companies. And what I'm going to do when I go in there, I'm going to take, NIH has a budget of $42 billion a year. It spreads that budget to 56,000 scientists in research centers, mainly universities around the country. And it tells them, study this or that. And really what they're mostly studying is developing new drugs for chronic disease. But they're not telling us, why do we have all these, why are we the sickest country in the world? Why has autism gone from 1 in 10,000 in my generation to 1 in every 34 in my kids' generation? Why does 1 in every 3 kids diabetic or pre-diabetic? Why did peanut allergies suddenly appear in 1989? Nobody has the answers to these questions.
Right.
They're easy to answer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say to the agency, those are the questions we're going to answer now. We're going to figure out why we're the sickest country in the world. I'll say one last thing. During COVID, our country had the highest death rate on earth, the highest body count. So we had 16% of the COVID deaths, and we only have 4.2% of the world's population. We literally, whatever we were doing for COVID was wrong. We had the worst record of any country in the world. Now, what CDC says is that the reason we have the highest death rate is because we are the sickest people from chronic disease. That the average American who died from COVID, according to CDC, had 3.8 other diseases. So they had diabetes, obesity, asthma, and one other thing. And the question is, and so that's what was really killing them. It was chronic disease that was killing them. It wasn't COVID. COVID just pushed them off the edge of the cliff, but the chronic disease got them to the top.
They had comorbidities.
Yeah, and what I want to do is to end the comorbidities. It's costing us, it's bankrupting us. It's gone from 4% of our GDP when my uncle was president to 17% today, our medical costs, and it's all chronic disease. It's costing us $4.3 trillion a year. That's 5 times our military budget. And we can end it. We can end it overnight. We have to identify what's causing it. Is it high fructose corn syrup? Is it glyphosate from Roundup? Is it neonicotinoid pesticides? Is it the forever chemicals? It's an easy thing to identify them and then to eliminate them. So, and that's what I'm going to do.
We don't have too much time, and we've barely scratched the surface of the things that I want to chat with you about. But I'd like to dive into this question because it affects not only the LGBT community, but all Americans. Between 20 and 45% of homeless youth identify as LGBT, and more than 25% of LGBT adults reported experiencing food insecurity last year alone. What policies will you offer to help the LGBT community and all Americans as we struggle with lack of affordable housing, food insecurity, inflation, and the increasing frustration that we have while we see all of our hard-earned tax dollars going overseas to these endless wars?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question because One of those questions goes to inflation. Inflation, I'm going to end the wars, which are driving inflation in this country. We spent $8 trillion on forever wars, and we're, since 2001, and we're less safe here. We have more enemies at home, abroad. Our country is poor. We've gutted the American middle class, and we're suffering inflation because inflation is a tax on the poor, and it's the way that governments pay for wars. They don't come to us anymore and say, we're going to get you to buy war bonds like they did in World War II, or we're going to tax you to pay to overthrow Saddam Hussein. They don't do that. Or to go into Ukraine. They say, they don't say anything. They just declare war, they fight the war, and then they print money. And when they print money, it debases our money, the money that you have in your Social Security account, you have in your 401k, that, it shrinks your salary. It's a tax on the poor. It's a theft. I'm going to end the forever wars, number one. But the crisis, there's two other crises besides inflation. The homeless crisis is driven by housing prices, as you say. 50% of the homeless people in our country are in California. And the places they are the places that have the highest housing costs. The reason that you're seeing homelessness in this state is because we have the highest housing price of any state. There's a direct correlation. There's been lots of studies on it. Homelessness is exacerbated by drug addiction, mental illness, depression, and those kind of things. But the real root cause is just housing prices. And so we got to get the housing prices down, and we have a whole program for reducing housing prices and putting more stock. One of the key things we need to do is to stop the big investment houses from buying up all our single-family homes, because that's what's driving up the price of housing and making it unaffordable. BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Blackstone, Fidelity. These companies own, 88% of the S&P 500, and they are now trying to buy all the residential homes in our country and the agricultural land, and we should not allow that to happen. We should not allow these big investment houses to buy, or firms to buy up our housing stock. We also need to incentivize localities to drop some of the zoning restrictions that make new housing stock. For example, people ought to be able to build. There's all this new, wonderful, beautiful, elegant-looking housing options, prefab houses that are small houses, or tiny houses, or attachment buildings. And we need to reduce some of the regulatory burden against those, and to free up some of the land that is now that's lying vacant in America's cities. There's 280 shopping malls in our country that have gone bankrupt and are just sitting there fallow. And we need to open those to allow housing to be constructed. And I have an entire retinue of policies, but my aim is to make sure that every kid, in the millennial and the Gen X generation can afford a house. If you work hard, if you play by the rules, you ought to be able to buy a home like my generation could. And that's my life objective, to make sure that happens.
Lastly, I just want to give you a moment to speak to all of our viewers, LGBT and beyond. Why should we vote for you for president, and how will you help us heal this terrible divide?
Yeah, first of all, there's nobody who's going to defend LGBTQ rights more than me. I've been fighting for civil rights my whole life. I believe that everybody in our country and everybody in the world is entitled to respect, to compassion, to kindness, and that your sexual orientation, the person that you choose to love should not be a factor in denying you rights or subjecting you to prejudice or bigotry. It just is a no-brainer for me, and I'll fight to the death to make sure that that doesn't happen to people. But there are also just larger issues, and they're the issues of how do we end the vitriol and the poisonous division, the polarization that is tearing our country apart. My father, we are now more divided than at any time since the American Civil War. The one time in history that, in American history, where we had this kind of division before was in the 1960s when my father ran for president, when our cities were burned. Over 100 cities burned that year. And Martin Luther King was shot. My father was shot that year. We had violence on our campuses. We had kids being killed by federal troops. We had riots in our cities all over the country. My father entered the presidential campaign at that time, and in the end, 3 months later, on the day he died, he won the most rural state in our country, South Dakota, and the most urban state, California. He ran as a uniter rather than a divider. And I was with him when he died in California. We took my dad on the train, on his last train ride from New York, from Penn Station in New York to Union Station in Washington, D.C. It was supposed to be a 2.5-hour ride, but it was 7.5 hours. And the people, because there were 2 million people on that train track, they had been his supporters, and they were every color of the rainbow. They were, they were whites. There were people in military uniform. There were Catholic priests and nuns. And there were rabbis in the big urban train stations: Trenton, Newark, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Wilmington. There were thousands of black men and women singing the battle hymn of the Republic. And it was the same crowds that I'd seen all along the campaign trail with him on that campaign and the earlier campaigns. He was able to create a populist movement that united all of the different people in our country: middle class, working people, blacks, Indians, Hispanic people. And I'll give you an example. 4 years later, a lot of the whites who were lining that train track, a majority of them, this demographic data showed, supported in the 1972 election not George McGovern, but rather George Wallace, a man who's hateful, bigoted, segregationist, who was antithetical to everything that my father represented. Yeah, my father had been able to get those people to support an idealistic, kind, compassionate vision for our country. And he had been able to unify us. In short, when I announced my candidacy 19 months ago, I told that story and said, that's what I intend to do. I'm not going to feed into the vitriol, to the anger, to the name calling. I'm going to criticize people for policies, but in a way that's congenial, that's respectful, and that is about a conversation. And then I'm going to seek to identify the values that we all Americans have in common, rather than focus on these little culture war issues that the big shots use to keep us all at each other's throats. And that's what they're doing. It's the jangling keys. They're saying, look over here, and hate each other. Oh, they steal the bank, rob the bank over here. And I want to put an end to that and bring together Americans, and we can solve all these problems. We have monumental problems right now. We have the worst health of any country. We have the solution. We have the best functional medicine and integrative medicine doctors in the world doing cutting-edge stuff in our country. We have the worst agricultural policies in the world, yet we also have the best regenerative farmers and organic agriculture. We're at the cutting edge of that. We have some of the worst corrupt business practices, but we have the best entrepreneurs. And so we have the ability to solve all of our problems, but we can't do it when we're all hating each other. We need to bring Americans together. We need to bring people who are gay, people who are straight, people who are black, white, everybody who loves our country, and we need to start treating each other with respect. And what I found is those common landscapes are much, much larger than the little things that the big shots use to make us hate each other. And that's what my campaign is about.
And at one time you said, give me a sword and some ground to stand on, and I'll help you take your country back.
That's right.
So here's a St. Michael pendant,
Oh my gosh.
and on the back is a sword that will
I
come
love
out.
that.
So you can have that sword and continue to fight the battle. And this will be the first of many conversations that we have, Mr.
Thank
Kennedy.
you very much, Ronnie.
Thank you for your time. Very much
Good to
appreciated.
meet you.
And thank you everyone for being here with us today. Mr. Kennedy will join us on social media for several conversations between now and November 5th.